Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bios and Bookmarks, Season 7, Episode 4. I'm Shivani Ramlochan, Bios and Bookmarks producer, and it has been a pleasure to be at this point, mid season, with all of you, talking about our theme, A Change is Gonna Come. As you'll know, we named this season after the anthemic 1964 Sam Cooke song, and it asked the question, how can we, from where we are in the Caribbean, as well as around the world, work to make the world a better place, especially in what feels like fractured and difficult times? I am delighted that this episode's guest is Xavier Navarro Aquino, the Puerto Rican writer who will be sharing with us from his debut, Velorio, published by Harper via Books. Xavier will be in conversation with our very well known friend of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest, Breanne Mc Ivor. Allow me to introduce you to her. Breanne was born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago. She studied English at the Universities of Cambridge and Edinburgh before returning home. She's been shortlisted for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, the Glimmer Train Fiction Open, the Fish One Page Prize, the Derek Walcott Writing Prize, and the BCLF Elizabeth Nunez Award for Writers in the Caribbean. In 2015, she won the Caribbean Writers David Howe Literary Prize. Where There Are Monsters, her first short story collection, was published by People Tree Press in 2019. And in very exciting news, her first novel, The God of Good Looks, will be published by William Morrow and Fig Tree in 2023. So, as I've just said, Breanne will be discussing Xavier's debut, Velorio, with him. It is a novel that is mired in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and what Xavier does in the eye of devastation and natural ruin is truly spectacular and unforgettable writing. It is the kind of novel that I am convinced, if you read it, would profoundly impact the way you not only live your life, but the ways in which you see the world. I know you will enjoy the conversation to follow. And of course, I know you will have not forgotten that this year's NGC Bocas Lit Fest is right around the corner. From the 28th of April to the 1st of May, you can find our full festival program online and start bookmarking your events. As always, if you like what we do at the NGC Bocas Lit Fest, please consider becoming a friend of the Bocas Lit Fest. You'll see links for all of this and more during the course of our live event. Thank you for tuning in. We're delighted you're here.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that, Shivani. And I could not be more excited to be here. I am a bios and bookmarks super fan. So just to be a part of it is so wonderful. And I'm so excited to talk to Savi about Velorio. Um, I started reading it, and because I knew I was reading it for this program, I said I'm going to highlight everything that seems important and exciting to me. And I think I should have just highlighted the whole book. It was absolutely amazing. So please allow me to introduce Xavier. Xavier Navarro Aquino was born and raised in Puerto Rico. His fiction has appeared in Tin House, Timothy McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, and Guernica. He has been awarded scholarships from the Breadloaf Writers Conference and the Sewanee Writers Conference, a McDowell Fellowship, and an ACLS Emerging Voices Fellowship at Dartmouth College. He is an assistant professor of English at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches in the MFA program. Safi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brianna. It's great. It's great to be here. I'm also a fan of, of Bios and Bookmarks. I've been periodically looking at sort of the backlog of some of the interviews and conversations that have occurred through Bocas Lit Fest. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Shivani. Thank you, Bocas Lit Fest, and of course, thank you, Brianne, for joining me in conversation.
Oh, it is. It is absolutely my pleasure. And thank you to everybody who's listening along. If you have any questions or comments, like please pop them in. I think that one of the things that I love that Bocas does in this is it lets you just like ask the authors whatever you want. So I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody. And I think there's no better way to kick this off than to invite Xavier to give us a reading from Velorio. So sit back, guys. This is going to be good.
Thank you. It's always a strange thing to try to find something to read from a novel, especially a novel that's told in multiple perspectives. The novel is told through 6 characters and a 7th character towards the end. So I thought last minute. I mean, initially I always read a standalone piece that kind of feels like a scene, so it feels like its own short story that it's readable. But I thought it worthy to read from the beginning of the novel, from the perspective of Camila. And I will let her, I guess, introduce the book to you because she is the opening character of the novel. So we'll start with her. It wasn't until after I dug out her body that I learned to love my sister Marisol. You'd think it's strange to see destruction as a way to learn her, to grow with her and our people, but that's how it went. It started with the mudslide that came through and busted my bedroom window. As Huracán María raged outside, Marisol slept with all our dreams. No one can tell you how much pressure is outside during a huracán, and the rain clouds unstitched, the wind breezing, and the storm. A large squeeze in your entrails and a hum so loud you begin to forget. Those howls sing in tiresome anger. You feel your ears pop. Las turbinas de un avión is what Mommy chanted throughout the night, and I felt our house tremble like I believed God was fuming. We all did. Mommy held on to us after the lights went. Mommy felt the ground shake from under our feet and walked with Marisol and me, hand in hand, to the bathroom. There we curled under the wooden vanity and she prayed, Dios will be here. He will. But what if he's not? Marisol asked. He will, I snapped back. That was all I could say or needed to say. She tugged on my dress at first, then moved her fingers away from mine and left us there. Marisol, ya, mami, I'm going to sleep. So sleep here, nena. But she didn't listen. She went to my bedroom and shut the door, and that was it. Now, I carry her with me. It started with me taking a piece of her, the tip of her pinky, the one that stuck out from the mud. I cut it from her hand with a shard of window glass, only because Mommy told me that she is no longer with us, that we would have to wait for the people to come collect her. Mommy was too busy seeing me off, trying to nudge me away from all the dead satos washed up by Maria's currents. Mommy never checked up on Marisol, so I knew that it was okay. I never saw Mommy cry. When Marisol disappeared into my bedroom, Mommy simply went to the window and watched God deconstruct the landscape. Maria serving as his contractor. She stopped praying, but I knew she still believed. So I guess that's why I wanted to perform a resurrection. A week after Maria left, Mommy spent most of the day counting our water containers, checking to see if we had access to the river to collect water, whatever liquid we could to flush the toilets. She started whacking away with her machete at the web of branches that kept us for some time trapped on our end of the street. Her broad black shoulders flexed with every stroke she landed, her short hair disfigured and her mouth open and breathing heavy. She then started to ration out the little trash bags we had, so as to not waste them. She said the mountain of filth would start collecting and we'd need every one of those bags because the garbage people were not coming. Not anymore. The only time Mommy seemed to show any emotion was when I used the toilet. I peed and flushed, and Mommy stormed into the bathroom with a broomstick and swatted my feet. Eso no se hace. Do not ever waste water like that again. Ma! I started to cry. I'm tired of the smell. I don't want to keep going on top. Cállate, Camila. If you flush again without letting more days pass, you will go outside. So I did. For some time, I took to peeing in the darkness. I tried to wait until I desperately needed to do it, found a spot where two giant palm trees snapped in the middle and served as a natural barrier. Nothing but the quiet moon shining its light, helping me avoid making a mess. After the storm, there was no water in the colmado, and I needed to find Marisol some hydration for her lungs and for her wounds. Even though Mommy said not to talk to her, to leave her alone, I figured she needed water, or food, or something. I think Mommy was afraid because we were only prepared to keep hold for 2 weeks, hoping that aid would come all the way into the forest to us in Utuado. Mommy started losing faith as time passed, and that's when I started to worry. The roads were swept off the mountain, and the river camped out in La Plaza. All that water around us, but none of it drinkable. This was before people got desperate. Some said they started collecting whatever was around. They started by setting all those dead things on fire just to taste something. When Mommy left me alone at night, I'd creep back into my room where a wall of crystallized mud trapped poor Marisol. I'd open the door and see a sweeping brown river frozen in a wave. I worked to chip away at it, every piece of her showing as I jabbed into the petrified gunk, slowly excavating Marisol back to life. During the daytime, I would walk around with Marisol's pinky in my dress pocket, and after a while, it started to stink. I missed her. Just after the huracan, like all people, I wanted to return to a normal state. So I took care to clean Marisol as best I could. It took a little time, but when I finally freed her, I dressed her with her favorite pair of jeans. They had a sharp tear on their knee that I thought looked distinguished. I found her nice blue blouse that had a smudge of dried blood on its neckline. Of course, Mommy was busy with the machete. She soon moved away from our house and started on the bridge that connected us to El Barrio. I knew she was trying to clear a path to God, to ask Him if He was planning on getting back to work anytime soon. Marisol, we need your help. I need you to wake up so you can help Mommy and the town. I shook her after putting clothes on her dusty body. I asked her to take me with her wherever she had gone, so far from all the water and mud. I asked if she was willing to see through her closed eyes one more time to try and leave all the green shades I imagined were in heaven. How the shine for the breaking waves and the ocean still captured the sun. That no matter how terrible the island looked, someday it would all heal. But Marisol just smiled, her eyes shut from the world. Okay, Mari, okay. I combed her hair with my fingers and imagined how nice she would look with the sun against her skin. Her hand with the missing pinky was a little smelly, so I rushed to the shed and teased out some gardening gloves. I went back to her and shoved them on. You need fresh air. You are starting to pick up that smell. I imagined Mari happy in her new home, and I made up conversations thinking how Mommy would react if I told her about Mari's new home. Mommy would probably object, but that's how I saw us all, talking to walls that didn't respond. She's a part of the dirt now, and the mountain is us. The mountain is our people. It's all part of the mountain, the ground, the sky, the sea, Mommy said. The sky floats, Mommy. It belongs to heaven, I said. Okay, Camila, but the sky would not exist if the mountain wasn't there. It would then be called something else. Without the earth, the sky isn't the sky. And the sea? The sea, Cami. The sea is water, and we are all water. But this is our mountain. This is our home. When you are lost, you search for the mountain. When you are lost, you never forget your home. I don't understand, Mommy. That's okay, Cami. That's okay. I'll stop there.
Wow. I already read it, and it was just so powerful to hear you reading it. I am so happy you actually chose to read from the beginning, because your book has this amazing first line. It wasn't until after I dug out her body that I learned to love my sister, Marisol. I like from that first line, I was just like, okay, this is gonna be good. and dark. And, it's just really going to excavate the aftermath of tragedy. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, writing a novel based on the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. I remember when it hit the Caribbean, just seeing the pictures, feeling the sort of like shock and horror, feeling almost a sense of deja vu because there have been so many hurricanes in recent years that's just come through the Caribbean. And I just wanted to know a bit, what was it like excavating this tragedy for your writing and taking this real event and, feeding it into your novel?
It was a strange thing because I had experienced a hurricane, Hurricane Georges, and we had some grazes throughout my time growing up in Puerto Rico, but Hurricane Georges was the most, I think, visceral remembrance of a hurricane. The largest hurricane before that of recent memory was Hugo in 1989, the year I was born. So Maria was definitely a sort of a reality check. Because for the longest time, I think because the way I guess when you sort of look at hurricanes in the Caribbean, you're kind of watching all these spaghetti maps that the weather forecast people are often putting, and for a long time it would miss Puerto Rico for whatever reason. It would develop north, it would develop south in the Caribbean and just miss us. But this was a different, I think, circumstance, and especially experiencing it from such a far place. I was in grad school, right? I was in the middle of nowhere, I would say, right in the heart of the United States in Nebraska. So I felt like a sense of desperation, wanting to be at home and be with my mother and my brother, because I knew that they were going to ride out the storm together at my mom's house. And so I remember calling my mom the night before the hurricane was set to come, because it surprised a lot of people, right? It kind of came into the Lesser Antilles, and then it developed drastically and really fast. And everyone on the news that I was following from abroad was like saying, maybe it'll miss, maybe it'll go in between Vieques and Humacao and Fajardo and not hit us. But it was pretty apparent that it was going to be a direct hit. And so I was on the phone with her, and I'm in grad school. I'm not earning much of anything, but I was looking at tickets and thinking of, I'll go back home and I'll at least be there and I'll help out in any way I can, math. But as my brother being sort of a clown, if you will, he said, "No, I think you stay put. Obviously, we didn't like ration for you. What are you gonna do coming here? And that would be foolish of you to do that." So I stayed put. But I remember that day I had to teach the next day as the storm was making landfall, and I'm sitting there like watching it sort of go through the sort of the heart of Puerto Rico, and in a very slow way. One of the things that was very I think impactful with that storm was how slow it was moving through that island, through Puerto Rico, and that sort of exacerbated mostly the effects of it. And then immediately after, of course, no one from the diaspora or anything had communication with anyone back home. Everything was shot. The communication was non-existent. And I came up with the hope that I would travel back as soon as I could, and I was lucky. I guess it's a sort of a mixed bag of emotion. I was lucky to be able to go back about 5 days after or so, give or take. I can't remember at this point, but it was immediately after. So there weren't any flights. There were so many flights canceled trying to go to the airport. I think the airport was just not functioning for the most part. But my flight didn't get canceled. So I was able to return home, and the flight was filled. I stopped in Atlanta, and the flight was filled with all the Puerto Ricans that wanted to return and help. And when we arrived, we saw the airport in shambles. Essentially, it was on generators. It was really hot and humid, of course. And everyone that was in the terminal trying to leave were obviously tourists. Which was trying to leave, and everyone that was trying to come in were Puerto Ricans trying to get home and trying to figure out how they could help or how they could find their loved ones and make sure that they could account for that everything was okay. So those things were very impactful to me. That aftermath and seeing that I did have a rental car that I managed to get, and I wasn't even sure it was reserved. I was able to drive, and I found that outside from all the trees and everything around my house, everything was okay, which was nice. But the landscape itself, I think, was the biggest impact for me to see. The Caribbean is very green, right? It's as Walcott always says, it's a very beautiful and very vivid place, just in its sensory details. And to see that stripped in its complete totality was shocking. And I think that's when I started thinking about what would a story be imagined in an aftermath like that. And it wasn't that far from reality, like to imagine a dystopia of circumstances of how people would have to negotiate and live life in the aftermath of the storm. So I think it was difficult, and I think for the longest time I didn't even write about the storm. I know a lot of artists, a lot of visual artists, painters, a lot of poets, and even fiction writers back home wrote in trying to process the storm and all its effects. But I wasn't of that mind. I just didn't have the capacity immediately after or years after the storm hit to write about it. But the inception of the idea was always there, and then reading about the real tragedy of a group of sisters that one of them had been encased by a mudslide that came through the window in one of the towns was the inception of Camila as a story. And when I was in an artist residency, that's when she haunted me enough to say, if you don't do this now in the woods in that discipline, then you may never do it. So I just figured, okay, I'll attempt and see how I can process and work through the images and everything that I imagined. And so that's how the novel came to be. But mostly, I think it's truly a mixed bag of emotions, right? When you're processing this, I think anger was so much a part of the project. I think grief, of course, and trying to just visualize everything was like a turning point for the island, at least in its very in a very structural way. But the novel definitely came from all those extreme heightened emotions, and very little of it, I think. I find it fascinating that the novel is spoken about in resilience or in those terms or in that capacity. But I think that there's just an inherent anger that came with how the characters negotiate those experiences. So yes, it was a difficult. I think, like most people would imagine, it was a very difficult time to think about all those implications.
Yeah, I completely get where you're coming from. As a writer as well, I find it hard to write about tragedy immediately after. I know that there are some people, okay, they say that's how they heal. That's not the case for me. I need enough space for it because, you're talking about, emotions like anger. I actually think that, the anger that different characters feel and directed at different people. Sometimes it's directed at the government, sometimes it's directed at somebody who should be a savior or who position themselves as a savior, but they weren't. Um, I actually think that if you as a writer have a clearer mind and you're not as angry as the characters, you can actually make the anger come across more, because I do think anger was one of these emotions like at the base of this, because the sense that I got reading it was, you know this is a government that has let the people down in the wake of the hurricane, but it wasn't a surprise that they did that. There are lines where you talk about politicians who they come around just before the elections and they pave the roads, and that's supposed to be good enough. And in a way, the hurricane and the destruction was this catalyst to manifest all these feelings that were already there. And I think that one of the things you do that's so effective and interesting is, like you said, you have these 6 different narrators, and they process not just their anger but all of their emotions so differently. Their response to the hurricane is so different. Can you talk to us a little bit about why you wanted to have so many voices speak, and was there any one character, one narrator who you felt closest to, and why?
Well, I guess to answer the first thing, it was a story about a community or about a group of people, and I think that when I sat down and said I have to write this story and these characters, I knew that it was going to be polyvocal. It wasn't going to be channeled by any one specific character. But as I think sort of my editor and my agent and and the team that came into the conversation with this book, we all came to the consensus that Camila was the heart of the book. And I often tell my students this, right? Like I'm always looking for where the heart of a book or a short story, whatever it is, to try to find where that capacity really lies. So I knew that she would be the start of it, but that it was always going to be a story about community, from told to the perspective of different characters that had very different ideas about what it means to survive that aftermath. Of course, you have a megalomaniac type character that considers himself very, very prophetic and wants to be the savior of all things. While his intentions are, it's hard to say his intentions are good, right? Because they're not good. They're not good. He's despicable in his own way, but he's complicated. He's complicated in the same way that colonialism is complicated, and especially neocolonialism, right? That it's Puerto Rico's status is that of a colony, a current colony of 3.4 now million people. So I wanted a character to carry that complication in its fullest capacity. And I always like to talk about Walcott and what he says about the Caliban figure, right? That in The Tempest, Caliban carries the most beautiful language. And I argued that Urayoan, this megalomaniac character that I'm speaking about, he carries very interesting and beautiful language that may be overlooked because of the actions that he takes to kind of enact his dream of setting up a utopia in the mountains in the aftermath of the storm. So he was complicated to write, but in editing, I think, is where he really was difficult. In writing him, it was quite easy. So as far as like just wanting to sort of get in the mindset of someone who doesn't allow language to bind him, I wasn't thinking about syntax. I wasn't thinking about whether these sentences make too much sense. And so in that capacity, it was very free, and it was easy to write. But to edit was another thing, right? My editor would say, okay, well, I get the intentionality of what you're trying to do, but he still has to make sense. So let's try to iron out some of his thoughts and go through those motions. But I would say that the character that I'm closest to is probably Banto, who's the best friend of one of the other protagonists, and he's a tragic figure because of the events that occur in the novel, but he's filled with optimism. And he's filled with courage. He finds his courage, I think, throughout the book, in spite of being bullied by the megalomaniac character as well. So he was interesting. Moribibi was interesting, and now I'm going like through all of them. Right, they're all interesting. All of them sort of carry very interesting ideas about what it means to process grief, what it means to process trauma. So I enjoyed them all in many different ways. But it was always meant to be a story about the many and not the few, or not the one. So I think that was the approach that I took.
I mean, there's so much there to dig into, but I love that you brought up Ura, this character. He sees himself, he calls himself over and over like a cacique. He sees himself as just this, like you say, megalomaniac leader. And I mean, I have to say that when I started this book, that's not where I thought it would go, like a book in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And then there's this character like trying to set up, this ideal society in the mountains. I just think that twist, that was so brilliant. But I also think that Ura as a character actually really speaks to, the theme of this edition of Bios and Bookmarks, because the theme is a change is going to come. And that could almost be, in a perverse way, his tagline, right? Because when he sets up what he wants to be his ideal society in the mountains, he actually says Memoria is not to build profit, but to escape from the old and start anew. And, if you forget his megalomaniac tendencies, you can see something noble in that, right? You can see somebody who just sees a system that's not working and is trying to create a change, even if, and increasingly as the novel goes on, the change is around what a great and wonderful person he is. And I love that you pulled back the curtain and gave us a peek into the editing process, because people might read this finished version and just be like, wow, this is such a great piece of writing. And you were like, no, editing the character was hard. Like, there's all of this stuff that happens in the lead up that's hard. But I wanted to know if you can talk to us a bit about Ura, his character. And I was particularly intrigued by him thinking of himself as a cacique, because it's pulling from, the indigenous people who are here in the Caribbean. And I'm part Carib. That's one of Trinidad's first peoples. And you don't see a lot of books that draw on, the history of indigenous people in the Caribbean. So I'm particularly interested in, what being a cacique means to him, and, what he gets from this history. And also I'm just interested in his character in general, because you're right, he's so complex.
Yeah, I think it's an important observation and question in thinking about how he envisions himself in relationship to indigeneity as well as sort of empires, because he makes these claims of being sort of colonized by two empires, but he's very much he fancies that the ideology of being a chief, being a leader in that capacity. And so he takes, and these are mentioned in the book, that he takes his inspiration from the cacique that drowned one of the Spaniards very early on to prove that they weren't gods when they arrived. And he envisions that. And so he takes all the worst possibilities of being a leader and tries to acclimate them to fit his vision of wanting to feel that the only way to change something is through a dictatorship, essentially, in a very small place, through vulnerable characters, right? So he's preying on the vulnerabilities of people in the aftermath, with the ideology of thinking that this is the best way because it will allow for everyone to start fresh without those carried histories of colonialism, because it's so apparent and so real to him and to everyone in the aftermath. But when he thinks about indigeneity, I think he misreads, right, many things, and that's what makes him an intriguing character, because he's faulty in that way, that he doesn't process like those histories adequately. He assumes that it must mean through aggression, or it must mean through control. Those are the very things that colonization tries to do, right? Is to impose aggression, to impose control. And in Puerto Rico, it was most evident through language, of course, very early on when the U.S. took place, but of course the Spanish Empire as well. So those things were often what he imagined to be, well, if I can eradicate all those histories and start new memoria, right? I'll be able to establish a new foundation. But he's enacting those same exact structures of eradicating history and bringing it forward. So he takes from what he wants, right? He's very opportunistic is probably his best word. He's very opportunistic in that way. But his intentions are not wrong. His intention is that he wants to rid himself from the current structure of commonwealth that Puerto Rico finds itself in, like a perpetual commonwealth, but also from all empires. And he roots it in indigeneity, in the heart, in the mountains, in like the spirit of what it means to be Puerto Rican in its essence, right, from that history. And yet he imposes colonization essentially to that community that was vulnerable. So it's, to me, my hope is obviously with him that he will be argued with, that if people read the book, they will often be thinking about him and looking at him at the sentence level, because I wanted him to carry those nuances at the center, those contradictions. He contradicts himself quite often with his actions, but also with what he says. And by the end, near the end of the book, he has this moment where he commits a very violent act with one of the protagonists, one of the other characters, and he regrets that act, right? He takes himself to the river and he washes himself from all those actions, and that's essentially one of the last moments that you see him speak, is that he's remorseful of that, which is a very powerful thing for him, because he never shows remorse throughout the entire book. But that's such a small moment, but I think it's a very powerful moment, and I think what I've seen, or what I've imagined, is a lot of people overlook that's humanity, even if it's sinister and it's a terrible humanity. It's still, so how do we contend with that? And that moment, however minor, a moment of grace that he um, that he commits. But yes, I don't have all the answers to him. I wish I did. I mean, I would hope that that I could be the source of that information. But for the most part, I think he confuses me too, right? He confuses me in his intentions.
I I love that you say you don't have all the answers to him, because I've never bought into this idea that like the author is a god of the book and they know everything. Like, no. But one of
Well,
the
because
things,
characters develop themselves as you write them, right? Like you know this that they that when you're in the process of writing, you may have an idea of where this character may want to go. But as you start exploring their intentions and their reactions to events or their reactions and how you cast them, they're going to change. And so you're not going to know immediately what are those changes going to be. And so you're left at the end of it going, well, this happened. So what do we do with this? Oh, I don't know. It'll be a lot of interesting questions from it. Yeah.
no, completely, like characters have their own authenticity. Like, and you're right, they take you on journeys. You're like, oh well, this is where I am now. Cool. Um, but one of the things that I loved that you showed, to just stay with Ura, was how somebody like him could come to power, because he has this sort of like army of like child soldiers. He calls them the Reds. And there's a scene in the beginning where they're giving out pamphlets about Memoria. And it's a joke. Everybody's like, what is this guy? Like, but because there's a power vacuum, and because people have nowhere to turn, and people are getting hungry, and people have no resources, he starts to become more and more appealing. And through your different narratives, you can just see how people end up drawn to him, like how they end up there. And I just think that that is potentially such a great commentary on just politics and leadership in general, how certain leaders come to power and how people embrace them. Like, I mean, were you thinking about that? Were you thinking about like world events and world leaders, and you're like, I'm going to, this is going to be a metaphor?
Well, I think it was very difficult to ignore all the consequences of sort of media and rhetoric in the United States, because that's where I was at while I was writing the book, and of course that was the presidency of the Trump presidency. So it was very apparent that sort of autocrats were the vogue and were the new thing, or not the new thing. I mean, they've been around for quite a bit, but it was reemerging in this country. So um, that noise was definitely carried with some of the implications that he has. Um, but he's to me, he fills that void by taking advantage of people through the very systems that are in place now of trying to strip people from accessibility to education or accessibility to resources, that our own government has implemented, or an external government, right? The junta is what they call the fiscal board has implemented, had implemented, um, and that to me has always been intriguing, right? Intriguing in the sense that when you strip accessibility to resources, whether it's actual resources, whether it's food or water or gasoline, but also educational resources, then you have the opportunity that arises with Urayoan, that what it presents is someone who's giving options that are not there. And so he takes advantage of the vulnerable population, which he calls the Reds, like these orphans or children that don't have that direction. And he uses that as a platform, because they see him and all they want throughout the novel is sort of repeating, I want violence, we want violence. So it to me was very visceral, right? All those noises, all those external noises of this country, the United States, but also the Puerto Rico as a country in itself. How leaders sort of position themselves, how they, as you said at the beginning, how they kind of return whenever it's time for them to delegate and try to win votes and then disappear again, and so corruption is very much a part of the conversation that he's bringing forward.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to take a quick minute to just thank everybody who's tuning in. We have authors who are tuning in from Jamaica, from Puerto Rico. Thank you, like, to all members of the Caribbean community. I've genuinely found that the Caribbean community of writers is the most supportive, kindest, wonderful. So thank you all for tuning in. Especially happy to see, people who are based in Puerto Rico. Like, this is especially for you. And I think this is the perfect time to move into our second reading. So if I could invite you again to read from your novel.
Yes, this would be the first time I'll be reading this character. I've read a few of them, but since she appears at the end, and I think it's no secret that she's not alive. It's Marisol, her sister. She returns for one final moment, or her moment rather, at the end of the book, and I wanted to carve out that space for her. So I'll start with her. It's a short excerpt. All things are born in weeping. Beyond the sea, there are many islands, and more of us. You can't see us now since so much has been washed away or buried, and all that is left is a place talked about as a pearl of the Caribbean. It's like memory and sound, fading the more time presses on. I think of Camila, and then I think of Mommy singing when the weather turned, and she'd smile while humming Lamento Borincano, trying to forget all that was changing. See, she sees me in that light, and in contrast is when we are most visible, which is never really about us at all, is it? It is about you. The memories soon forgotten from that place, impossible to reach. The trails marked in red paint lead you to rediscover, remember, a memoria scripted with graveyards. Memoria held together if only to keep that desire to be complete. When she took me out from the membrane, I felt cold. It was always cold in that open space. The living do not see it as confinement, though that's what it is to me. My comfort is in a frozen river or impossible oceans, and hers is the open air. She wanted me free. I wanted to stay there in my room and be safe where no one could find me, even though no one was looking. There, I can forget that my mother tried, and so did my father, and I wouldn't have to remember disappointment. But there are no more parents, no more aged bodies giving wisdom. I wanted to tell her that it was going to be okay, that she would find me someday, if not in her life, then after. Memory can be fraught and evil when it tiptoes close to recollection, never material and exact. But they took me from her before I had a chance to leave her with a path clear enough to walk on. They took things as they always did, and so they took me away, filed me into a refrigerator with no memory. She needed me, and I left her there as empty as this island. And there can be no more words telling about our survival, and there can be no greater ache. The sea tells us there are more islands, and that there are more of us without names, only memory. It is not us who remembers, but the water that brings us home and rocks us smoothly. Smooth and soothingly I sang as much as she did when we set our eyes into a broken horizon and wished to forget. That moment was ours. When she took me from my embryo, she placed me in a deep and dark cave above our town, the sharp stalactites biting down at the lips, the fruit bats rushing out at night, and she left. She felt their sloppy formations hit against her dark cheeks. But that is not important. What is how desperate she was to stay with me for as long as she could. And I pitied her for it because I was very happy to not worry about my language forced into famine, that I didn't have to live in the periphery of myself. And I'll stop there.
Phrase, that phrase, my language forced into famine. Oh, the writing, so good. Um, I want to thank everyone for their comments. And if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. But we are so happy to have you here with us. And I think that on that, speaking around language, I love that this book was not constrained by English. Um, I feel that, sometimes not too long ago, writers like us, people who are writing from the Caribbean, were asked to make our work more accessible, whatever that meant. Or, asked to be like, oh, can you explain yourself? Like, explain what this means. And I love, the way that your language just shifts effortlessly. And I wanted to know if you can talk a bit about your language choices in this book. Was there ever any instances where somebody said, "Oh, you need to explain what that means," or was it just a case where no, you were like, "I know what I want to do, and I'm not, I'm not dumbing it down or explaining it to anybody."
I was really lucky, I think, to end up with the imprint that I was that I had with Harper V at HarperCollins, because my editor, she acquires a lot of international voices, right, and they do a lot of work in translation. So she's understanding of the importance of how a writer has to negotiate these things when we're thinking about sort of mass production, when we're thinking about accessibility to larger audiences. So she never brought that into the forefront. I think the only thing that was always in the conversation was um, how do we make things accessible for things and a meaning in as far as meaning, right? So Urayon wasn't about the language in translation or moving between English and Spanish. It was, well, is he making sense? Right? Are his rants making sense? So that was what she was most keen about in thinking of trying to not create obstacles that are not necessary. But as far as like transitioning between English or Spanish or whatever it may be, that never came up, which I was very fortunate, because I don't think that's not common. First of all, I know that's not common. It's becoming a little bit more of a pushback and a conversation, because more writers are now saying like, no, like we don't have to explain ourselves. Viet Thanh Nguyen, obviously, with the sympathizer, he has this famous tweet. That's how we talk now, with famous tweets, where he says writers of color, or just writers of minorities, do not write as if you don't have to explain yourself. I think that's an important thing that we have to think about when we're writing, is that we don't ask the dominant structures, whether it's white writers or others, to explain themselves when they're writing. And so to me, it was never. I always understood that, and I always hoped that I would end up in the hands of someone who also felt that way. So that wasn't the issue. I think when I think about language, I think about bilingualism on the island, and I think about how Puerto Ricans think in both languages. And it's not to say that everyone on the island speaks fluently English. I think that's not an accurate assessment, but I think that we are exposed to both languages all the time, whether it's when we're driving, or we're watching TV and flashing through a commercial, or we're watching a movie, if we happen to catch a movie in the theater, or whatever it may be. So that is inherent in how we're approaching the conversation. And I think now, over 100 years of having English imposed, we are bilingual in that capacity. So I wanted the characters to carry that freedom to exchange between English and Spanish, because there are some things in its most obvious way that they can't express in English that they'll be better adapted expressing in Spanish. And so that's how I think about them when they were negotiating language in the book. And I don't have I don't have a formula as to when or why. I just think that whatever felt natural to the characters in the moment that they were in conversation with someone else or with themselves, carried the language that was necessary. It is an important thing, right? When we think about how do writers have to negotiate these trenches of accessibility, because it's essentially capitalism more than anything. It's just wanting to sell more, specifically to a white audience, because they're the ones that they perceive to be the readers, which is a fallacy as well. So yeah.
So I I love that whole answer. In the comments, Dr. Sylvia Roseanne Walker, she said, "I didn't have to live in the periphery of my life." Powerful. And I actually think that quote is just applicable to what you just said. Like, us as writers, we don't have to be on the periphery of our own writing. We don't have to, explain our writing. I love your explanation. And I wanted to touch on a character who I love, and just because there's so much depth and nuance in this book, we haven't got to him yet. Cheo, um, he writes, I worry about what new means and what rules we etch into law if sacrifice is the only way of giving birth. Should everything new be born from tears? And I think that that's a question that we ask in the Caribbean. Like, does moving forward, does creating this new society always have to have, growing pains of new nationhood, of selfhood, suffering and grief? And what I love about Cheo is that he's a writer, and as he gets towards this masterpiece, as he gets towards this sense of figuring out what he wants to write, you actually show the lines that he crosses off, the lines of poetry that he decides don't work until he gets to what does. And why did you decide to actually show his process on the page that way, and to show him thinking through the process of writing before he gets to his eventual masterpiece?
Yeah, it's because I'm a failed poet. he's a he was a joy to write, and I think he was definitely he was a necessary part of the process for me, because one of the things that he tries to capture is the importance of and keeping an account, a record of what matters. And it's not just a journalistic record of what occurs, but it's also an emotional record. And so he finds that through poetry. He was inspired. I mean, of course, my ventures into trying to be a poet, but mostly Shabine from Derek Walcott's Schooner Flight, right? Thinking about how does Shabine negotiate these histories, and in many ways he feels a certain like kingship with that conversation of Caribbean poets and Caribbean poetics. And that to me was I think an important piece that I wanted to capture with this book, that this is a Caribbean story, and I was very adamant about that. Yes, it takes place in Puerto Rico, and it's directly involved with the aftermath of the hurricane on the island, but Cheo, as an example, sees himself as a Caribbean person. And that is not often the conversation that is circulated in Puerto Rico. We often associate with Latin America, mostly because of language. And I think that's a sort of a fake pass of racism. But I think one of the things that I really wanted him to capture was this idea of that history, of a larger history of Caribbean letters, and how that has informed how he thinks. Right, and what is lost and what is gained. He references Julia de Burgos as well, which she herself was kind of tragically forgotten until now she's been reclaimed in modern history. And so he carries that history, right? He carries that through his poetics, and he says that poetry is what keeps us alive. That's one of his quotes that he manages to capture, but that he says that we're all poems in progress, or we're all poetry in progress, and that's one of his ways where he's processing, okay, well, this line doesn't work, that line doesn't work. And I think it was helpful for him, it was helpful for me to sort of strike out the things that he felt were excessive, and it's a process of editing in some ways, but I felt it necessary. I felt it necessary to demonstrate a very literal revision or an editorial eye towards what can happen, but still maintaining that image, right? If you read through that strike through, you can still see what he originally had written, and how he's processing that experience. So I love him. I love him mostly because he's everything that I would hope I could have accomplished with poetry, but he accomplishes it, and he found his way onto the page forever in a book. And that to me is very powerful for him, is that he has the poem that he leaves us with, the poem that he's searching for. Because he's searching for an answer. He's searching for answers through his work, through his language. And through that messy process of writing, he finally achieves what he feels is the final poem that he can leave us with, which is a little bit of a longer poem and a journey through the Caribbean, right? Through him being cast into the ocean. And so he's surveying how he sees Puerto Rico, how he sees all the islands, connected in many ways through that shared history, but also the shared histories of environment, the shared histories of natural disasters, et cetera, et cetera. So those things were very meaningful to me, were very meaningful to him. But I think just to carry the power of language and the power of poetry. I always like to tell my students, or anyone who's a fiction writer or a prose writer, that if they're not reading poetry, they're doing themselves a great disservice. Because to me it's probably it's a more powerful vehicle than prose is in some ways. But I am biased, so that could just be that could just be it.
I can think of no better place to end the Velorio conversation than on that note about the power of language. But we are going to move in. It isn't over. We're going to move into a segment called Promptly Written. And if you've been following Bios and Bookmarks, you know there's this fun segment. I look forward to it in the episodes. I'm like, what's going to be the question this time? So this is the scenario. You step into an elevator where the publisher and the editor of your dreams are in conversation about a specific topic. It's up to you to pitch them your dream subject for that topic. Now, it could be anything. It could be a book, a play, a sculpture, a musical, an album, like literally anything creative that your heart desires. And the topic is Every Man Bleeds for His Country First. Go.
Oh my, yes. I think I'm gonna take this quite literally because I get tattooed. I'm heavily tattooed. So I would pitch to them, and this might be pitching myself, to tell a story of an aspiring tattoo artist and how they have to negotiate the art world, because I think tattooing itself is very closely associated with visual art, and there are many artists that sort of represent that. So um, I would want to see a collage of exhibitions of tattoo work, artwork, large mass scale tattoos. That's what interests me the most, like these large scale tattoo projects that incorporate the motions and the visions of the body and how they move, um, and have sort of like a demonstration of it, maybe a live demonstration of tattooing as well. It's always fun to sort of see how blood comes out of the body and how it kind of how they're creating that pigmentation to stay for as long as it can. Usually, it's for the rest of your life, but that's what I thought of when I see this quote. I think of that. Every person bleeds for the country. Well, imagine a Puerto Rican artist. I can think of obviously my tattoo artist who's Puerto Rican and sort of has has created this wonderful body of work of very eloquent and large scale tattoo projects. So every person bleeds for their country, for his country or her country, for their country. It has to be something about tattooing. I think that it's so evident. There's so much of it out there now, and we need more of that representation. So maybe an exhibition or a novel. I'm telling myself I should write a book about that.
Yo, my jaw is on the floor. I'm like, that's your next novel, and that's the epigraph right there. Every man bleeds for his country first. Like that sounds amazing. I would read it. I'm sorry it doesn't exist because like I want to end this conversation and like just start the book.
Yes.
And I hope you tell your tattoo artist about this conversation too. Like I was like looking at your arms, like the tattoos while you were speaking. Like just no, I absolutely adore that idea.
Yes, I mean, I'm visiting him in the summer, so I'll definitely be sure to mention this and see what he thinks.
Yeah, I mean, and I'd love to hear what he thinks about the book, that imaginary book.
Oh well, yes. No, he bought the current book. He bought the Velorio, so I don't know if he's read it. He's very busy, but that would be interesting to have
He
that.
should give you like a tattoo inspired by the book.
I don't. We're running out of real estate.
Okay.
I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I can't believe it's been almost an hour already. I feel like I could just keep talking, but I have to say a huge thank you to you, Safi. You have been brilliant in just all of these incredibly wide-ranging answers, such powerful readings. If anybody watching has not read this book, like it is so urgent. I feel like urgent is a word that's sometimes bandied about a lot in literature, but just speaking as a Caribbean person, as somebody who has seen, so many natural disasters come through the region, and with global warming, unfortunately we can expect more. Like, there really is an urgency to this. It's about something that happened and continues to happen. So I really, from the bottom of my heart, encourage you to read it. I have to say a deep thank you to the NGC Bocas Lit Fest, to Shivani, the team behind Bios and Bookmarks. You guys, you do so much for Caribbean authors. You stand up for us every single time. You have done so much for me personally. So just a huge thank you and lots of love. And thank you to every single person who has tuned into this. If you are supporting Caribbean writers, if you're just supporting writers in general, we are really grateful. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I will be tuning in to the rest of Bios and Bookmarks, and I hope you do too. So thank you so much to everybody, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Yeah.